Welcome back, everybody. Our final presenter for the day is Nicholas Locke. Nicholas is new to the OCA family, sort of, but not entirely. He is the manager of the Guapiaçu Ecological Reserve, which is more commonly known as REGUA. It's located in the municipality of Cachoeiras de Macacu, within the Atlantic Forest, less than 2 hours from Rio de Janeiro. Nicholas has been living on, working, and then ultimately managing the property that he'll tell you a little bit about today since the late 1970s. And in 2001, Nicholas and his wife Raquel established an NGO with the goal of protecting the remaining forest in this area, including local communities in the work, filling in gaps by planting trees, supporting research in this unusual biome, and welcoming visitors to a tourism program. Since its inception, the NGO has secured 20,000 acres with an additional 10,000 acres in agreements and has planted over 800,000 trees. And I don't want to say too much more about the property. I've probably already said too much, but I'll turn it over to Nicholas to tell you a little bit about REGUA, what they're doing, and what they hope to do in the future.
It's really a privilege to be able to speak to you all and tell you a little bit about this project. My wife and I, Raquel, is here on my side.
Hello.
Hi, all of you. And we consider ourselves the luckiest of people to be able to be involved in this project. Let me see if I can share the screen. Tell me if it's going okay. Okay. Well, let me start off by saying that somehow we are imbued in history. And it was just wonderful to listen to your two previous, three, including Ken, who gave us this fantastic contextual presentation. But what was amazing to see is sort of through their eyes, these most fabulous areas of the past that have been very well preserved. And this is a picture of what Darwin would have seen when he landed with Fitzroy and the Beagle. Rio de Janeiro, let me see if I can move forward. Your screen, hang on a second. There we go. This is Rio de Janeiro as it was in the 1830s. Just an absolute beautiful place, and described by Darwin as having entered paradise with all these fabulous epiphytes hanging from trees, the greenness on these mountains that lifted up to the heavens. It really is fantastic. And we're always amazed at just the sheer number of naturalists who came to explore this region. This is in 1813 to 1830 was Baron von Langsdorff, the German ambassador to Russia. And he housed all these fantastic naturalists back in his farm. And this is very well documented, as seen by this publication in 2018. And when you reach to these lofty heights of the Serra de Mar mountain, which is really a sort of geological divide between the continents, we get to this sort of cloud forest, not quite as high as what Javier and Fabiano was saying, but a really amazing, very sort of cloud forest, high humidity, but also an amazing collection of orchids, as we see from the David Miller, who was here doing his studies amongst other people. Sadly, I love to hear Ken talking about the context, and here in Rio it's no different. The story, well documented by Warren Dean in his book on broadaxe and firebrand, as really we can't really consume forests, we can't really eat orchids. We really have to access land on which all these fabulous forests were growing in order to plant the crops in which we live. The story isn't that much different. My great-grandfather bought an estate here back in 1907, and together with his daughters, he developed this farm, this estate, bringing a lot of technology and new access, as you can see by the roads, and in fact destroying much of the forest in order to create what was the cycle of development, which occurred around the entire globe. It's not only only limited to this part of Rio de Janeiro. Sadly, the landscape suffers, the whole of the forest ecosystem really suffers as a result of this relentless drive for crops and of cultivation, leaving the forest changed, transformed into dead, almost grasslands that are just lifeless with very little to offer, and where natural restoration is actually very slow, very often very inadequate, because some people like to put fires to these grasslands. A story that you're well acquainted with, and as we see recently, the fires in the southeast, most of Brazil, in fact. And the story gets worse, as time goes by, these fires gradually cover entire hillsides. And the whole of this sort of beautiful landscape that Darwin and all these great naturalists saw and encountered back in just a mere 200 years ago have been utterly transformed into what are almost like desert areas, very, very hard to put back and restore. Rivers now running without their riparian forest, offering a really reduced number of species from that former glory. And the story sadly gets worse as these grasslands catch fire, killing off whatever is sprouting, whatever animals is found there, and whatever chance there is for its own natural recovery. So plans are needed, large plans, large-scale plans, especially in the Atlantic rainforest, because the Atlantic rainforest, as you well know, has been reduced to roughly a 10% or 12% of its original extent. And it's where 70% of Brazil's 220 million people live, because it offers access and a lovely place to live, and of course water. We started, basically I came out here from the UK, a gringo loco they call me, trying to work in farming and preserving a sort of way of life and the legacy of my great-grandfather and other relations as they took over the farm's administration. But very, very curiously, just by some freak coincidence, my brother sent a biologist along to stay with Raquel, my wife, and I at our home, and he started doing these scientific surveys on birds, producing this sort of lists of birds, which revealed that the forests of my great-grandfather's estate were still relatively well preserved. That prompted us to try and find some sort of way, looking up at these mountains, to try and work towards its conservation. Luckily, the Guapiaçu, meaning Rio Grande, you're all familiar with the Spanish terms, Rio Grande in Tupi Guarani, is still a watershed of 450 square kilometers with still 60% forest, which offers a fantastic opportunity for us to create a sort of case study showing people that restoration, conservation can be done if we turn our minds to it. Luckily, Stuart Pym, the Stuart Pym and Clinton Jenkins, they produced the science which showed that this area where we're currently located was worth every single ounce of our sweat and effort. We started in 2001 with a project, and obviously we had to engage with the local community. This gringo loco coming along and saying, what could be done? How could we save this for the future, for prosperity? What needed to be done? And we started with a team based on local manpower and local interest. For those of you who were acquainted with Rio de Janeiro, this is where we are, just slightly northeast of the Guanabara Bay, a bay that has been studied. It's got a sister in Maryland University as they study the Chesapeake Bay, a very similar size and very similar problems. And Rio de Janeiro on the left-hand side, and for you who are acquainted with the right-hand side, Niterói, São Gonçalo, and Alcântara on the right-hand side. The Beagle was actually anchored just off the right-hand side of this bay, and Darwin took his ride along this green belt that you still see were relatively well preserved, about 40, 50 miles from where we are. The ambition started in 1996 with this biologist, but we created a mission statement which was really trying to protect the Guapiaçu watershed. And what did we need to do? We needed to protect what forest was left. We needed to work with local community so that we could raise consciousness, so that they could understand what we were doing. There was a level of transparency needed so that they didn't think we were totally daft. We needed to restore degraded areas so that we could actually connect the existing fragments of forest. We needed to research how this forest worked, obviously incensed by the curiosity of these great naturalists and of reaching back to Humboldt himself. And lastly, we needed to make some sort of activities that could attract people to come and stay with us, and that could actually help us pay for all these activities. So our very first activity was in environmental education, a program reaching to local community, capacity building of the teachers, because the teachers themselves didn't really know what environmental education was all about. They really had not a bean of an idea. And bringing these teachers here, we taught them, and then they could actually help and foster this, and it grew to what is a very robust program today. But our most important contribution has been in restoring. And this started in 2004. And as Ron was saying, we've done over 800,000 trees or young plants have been planted to form over 1,200 acres of new forest, which are really thriving, doing well. To start this whole thing, you obviously have to know a little bit about your trees, and you do a phenological study. So you really go around through the forest in one of the most biodiverse regions, a global hotspot, listing trees, identifying them, trying to write down when they produce their flowers and then when they seed, and then gathering these seeds in order to find out how best they propagate and how they actually start their lives of growing again. So we did that, and we then brought all these seeds down. We worked with over 750 matrix trees, different species. It's really large numbers. I mean, everything's a bit off the scale in these three areas of Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil. But you're looking at one of the most biodiverse regions of the entire globe. So this is Marley working with the plants. We have to take them up into these most degraded areas. I'm sure your other partners and many of you have visited these really rough areas that have suffered so much from agricultural exploitation over so many years, and are really very impoverished soils, very nutrientless, with very little chance of a natural regeneration. So we have to carry these seedlings up in our mules, and there we have our team working and trying to plant these, digging holes in areas that are very steep and very tough. This is a typical example of areas that we plant and we try and restore. Some 90% of them our areas are doing incredibly well, but about 10% are in this sort of condition, which is actually incredibly tough. But what do? We try and make this into a sort of social party, a social fete. And every year we have dates that we commemorate, whether it be Environmental Earth Day, we're Water Day, we're International Water Day, or we have some Tree Day. And we arrange this so the local community comes in and we provide trees, and they become the co-owners of these trees. And in fact, we start to the whole program of empowerment, which is exactly what you need in order to raise awareness, increase transparency, and reduce mistrust. Some of the examples here are just wonderful. This is an area in 2005. Ron had been here. Peter Tobias had been here as well, together with Rosario Braga, and of course David Miller himself. But this is what the farm looked like, part of the estate that we changed. And this is where I tell you so enthusiastically that we can change things. We can change the world. It is possible. And if you look at some of these changes, look, we dug out all this, we made all these wetlands. So we dug out from the base clay to be able to make some ridgelites to contain as large area as possible. We then planted everything around. And you can see this sort of multi-species, because we were bringing species right from the top of the back of the mountains there that would have taken eons. I mean, really, I mean, almost things on a geological scale to be able to get to this, to the lower altitudes of this reserve. And then you can see the immense change that we're able to provide, which starts to work as an ecosystem. Yeah? Facing the three greatest challenges that mankind now faces, which is, as Ken so elaborately put, the extinction of species, water crisis and security, and lastly, the climate change. So we have to plant trees, and we have to plant trees on scale if we're going to change Wisconsin. And you know, we started working with really seed money, peppercorn grants, but we attracted the Brazilians through the SOS Mata Atlântica, and they helped us, which was really fantastic because we were getting local organizations to be able to fund us, which was really essential. And they funded the transformation of this for, wait for it, this. If I just point you, this is just incredible to see this transformation in about 10 or 12 years. It's really the minimum amount of time so that the forest can really start to function as an organism, which it needs to do. My grandfather's time was like this, and soon after the SOS Mata Atlântica, we actually managed to reach to a big oil company called Petrobras, and they funded a massive transformation. Not the back hills, which you can see are all denuded, they came back by themselves, but all this front line, as you're going to see from this photograph. And if I take you back just one photograph, you will see these back hills, the foothills of the mountains that go up, and they were visited by no other than Robin Chasden, who is now the most respected person in ecological restoration. So this shows you that forming a team, you can actually create a whole process which actually is continuous. It feeds into local community, empowers local community through various activities, and actually starts to close the gaps and alter minusculely, very locally, on a very small scale, the local climate, which is just exactly what we want. It also reduces urban expansion, which is something which is just the terror of all these areas. So you have these forests growing, and what do you do with them? Well, you know, you have to offer them and have them monitored so that you can show how these forests are growing graphically, writing articles. And so, in fact, there's Tim and Rosario, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with, looking at water samples, because Tim is one of the most respected limnologist professors in Rio. But we get all these students here to look at bats, how bats are using these new forests. What starts to come, it's ecological restoration on a large scale. This is incredibly exciting. And as a result of all of this, having transformed those lowlands through wetlands and planting trees, diverse tree habitat, we increased from something like 20 bird species to over 220, which is massive. But it brought in this chap here, Ron. Now, Ron, tell me, what is this chap here in a cage? Do you know what that is? Yes?
Looks like a tapir.
It looks very familiar to a tapir. And you're bingo, you actually hit the jackpot. There he is. This tapir was locally extirpated. It didn't exist in Rio State. And in fact, sadly enough, there are only 13 viable populations in the entire Atlantic rainforest of Brazil. They're much more common in the Amazon and going further north in the countries of our dear friends who also presented. But here in the state of Rio, they were extinct. And bringing these guys here, feeding them, giving them this very nice, soft release method whereby you feed them hamburgers or McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken just outside the door. If they should want it, they gradually lose this appeal for this sort of fast-cooked food, and then they go back into the forest where they establish. And this has been a phenomenal project in promoting what REGUA does, promoting forests, promoting and children love these things. They fall in love with these tapirs, so they reach back to their parents and tell them, Dad, Mom, let's not cook any more wild animals, bush meat. Let's try and respect nature. And this has become a fabulous tool to be able to reduce hunting. So as a result of this, we are creating new habitat. We are creating, we're planting more trees. It offers opportunities of work. All of this benefits tourism and research, and it strengthens environmental services, of course. And if we look at REGUA today, we limit ourselves statutorily within this yellow line, which is the 450 square kilometers, but you see the extent of REGUA's arm, in sense. Look at these green areas have all been secured by REGUA from 2000 in the institution's name, of course, and REGUA has been continuously buying land to reach to this magical 20,000 acres. And this is and in purple you see the areas of partners, and in priority you see areas that have been offered to REGUA, another 1,000 acres, which is fabulous, so that we have these opportunities and various people are running to our support to be able to secure this, make this a blanket cover for the future of the state of Rio de Janeiro. It really is wonderful. And of course, all of this still continues our education program, just gaining strength to strength. It reinforces our research projects. We've produced over 100 dissertations and theses with over 120 papers describing how rich this area is of Brazil and what we are able to do, which is very exciting. And lastly, which excites Raquel and myself so much, is that we're able to reach back to Humboldt himself and try and understand the complexities of these forests, how they work, their various canopy levels, the interstory, the interaction between fauna and flora, the inseparable nature of nature itself, as fauna depends on the flora and as flora depends on its fauna. And these are really keystone, corner, foundation species that you need to put in. And you have to have the right situation for them to go in. All of this was fantastic. Local people don't really care very much about conservation. But one thing they do care about, Ron, and do you know what that is? When it comes to the brass tacks, people are very worried about water. And we started changing our discourse, and we started telling everybody that, and they started understanding with all this elaborate thesis and dissertations papers produced, they started realizing that at the end of the day, healthy forests produce water. You've got the example, the Catskills, which works very well, and it's merely implementing that to our case study here, to REGUA. And of course, nowadays, when we look at water production, carbon sequestration through the growth rate of trees, and through this very soft eco-service of tourism, people they don't want to live in concrete bunkers. They want to come out and experience nature like all of us now. So this was very, very important, because finally we understood our raison d'etre. Our raison d'etre was strengthening eco-services of this particular region. And then everybody understood that. That was a compelling argument to be able to put land into under forest. It became an argument for people to sell their properties because there was no other use for them farming-wise, and they could see that through the reserves expansion, they would be actually improving the net benefits of this entire program. So this is what we do. We have these wetlands, which now we use as a schoolroom, an outdoor schoolroom, for people to understand the importance of certain areas. I'm not saying every area, but certain areas that really have to be put back into nature and allowed to flourish, and almost be an untouchable in that sense. You know, that we can use them to study, visit, and learn from, but we don't need to knock them out. We don't need to reduce them into just productive land. As a result of this, Ron, and all our lovely speakers, we the Rio de Janeiro Environmental Agency, the local government, the entire state government. Don't forget, Rio de Janeiro is the same size as Costa Rica, so we're talking about a very large area. They recognized that the Guapiaçu watershed, the Rio Grande watershed, was was a target area for conservation and a priority area for restoration. And that was the government who decided to offer funds towards restoration, reforestation in this particular area in order to preserve the water security for the cities that are just below in red, as you see from the picture. So this is what we're reaching to. As a result of this, we have become an outpost for a biosphere reserve. We're an IBA, an important bird area. We're a key biodiversity area, and we're headed by none other than a red-listed IUCN species called the woolly spider monkey, which everyone sees as being very important, as well as 47 species of bats, making this one of the richest areas of the Atlantic rainforest. There you are, some of the pictures of the wetland, and this is the areas that your friends will come and stay by the lodge. This is not the lodge, it's a conservation center in our nursery. And this is the woolly spider monkey, as you see. But if we go, and you know, we like to tell all the locals that Rio de Janeiro has the possibility of becoming a global reference for forest restoration with these numbers. So let us go to orchids, which is what the Orchid Conservation Alliance is promoting. This is one of the last pictures of Saudoso, for those who speak Portuguese. Our aching hearts long for the return of these two well, Belle's still here with us, but unfortunately David is no longer with us, and that's when we managed to give him some Yorkshire tea at his beautiful place that some of you will have visited. He was the man who, with this book, inspired Raquel and I to receive that English biologist, as he found this book written in English on the orchids of the Serra do Mar Mountains. His second book, listed over 800 species that are found here, and many of them are endemic. We later on received the visit by Rosario and the Orchid Conservation Society of Rio de Janeiro, who conducted their very, very first survey. And of course, it was very difficult for them to walk up these mountains and find, but they found about 120 species, and we made this delightful little booklet which listed and showed photographs of and where you could find these particular orchids. And then, of course, Rosario took this to heart, and she found some Cattleya harrisonianus, and as we were restoring some lowlands, a habitat that extended from the back of the Guanabara Bay all the way to the very base of the mountains, which have all gone. I mean, there's not even 0.01% left of these former glorious wetlands. Rosario decided to multiply and propagate Cattleya harrisonianus, and then for us and the team to tie them back on these trees that we were growing. There you go. Some of the more common, the bigger orchids are these: the Cattleya harrisonianus, the Miltonia admirabilis, and the Maxillaria cloesi. But it's this man that really changed things for us. This is Helmut Silhauer. He's the man who drew all those fabulous Pleurophalidinae. And the Pleurophalidinae, as much as Ken says, oh, some of them can go, man, we're just in love with these guys. These small chaps, these are the ones who make the most fabulous orchids. And we have compiled a list now of over 400. We've taken Rosario and the Orchid Society from 120 species to 420 species, finding many in the sort of habitat that you are very well familiar that we saw in our past recommendations. Here is sort of like the more common, of course. I don't have the very rare thing, but here's Promenea xanthina, the Prostectia caetensis. These are just things that Stellis. Of course, Stellis is a boring. You just find hundreds of thousands of them, but they're all here. They're all covering the tops of these mountains, where there is just this mist blowing through, very light sun. And these are the Zygostatus multiflora. And it goes on, the Maxillaria braidae. These are just as beautiful as you see, as we just turned on by those Draculas and the Lophantas that we saw in those beautiful presentations that we saw of Ecuador and Colombia. Octomeria, how can you not be turned on by this Octomeria? And this is what inspired me, because I read Dan Jansen's book on I think it's called The Ecology of the Tropical Forest, that he produced. It was only a tiny booklet, but he talked about this micro transect, it's not micro transect, it's one transect of 2 kilometers of bees that go along and just pollinate that one only species. That's their purpose in life. And I thought that was just so magical, so marvelous, that we had to learn and understand exactly what these species are. And that Octomeria, and look at this Pabstiella. Well, Pabst was around here. Pabst and Dunks were doing all their work in Nova Friburgo. You're all familiar with. These are just fabulous things. And Masdevallia, Infracta, again, they're no different from these beautiful orchids that you all love. Anathalis as well, there you go. Even with Octomerias, we just fall in love with them. And I actually wrote to Carlisle Lure, and Carlisle Lure had been here. He was very aged, from Florida University. Of course, you're all familiar with him. And he was just fascinated. I was so pleased that Mary is just in love with Pleurophyllidina. They are just such fabulous orchids on their own right. It's a different scale of things, but aren't the most beautiful things found in small flasks? There's other Anathalis. And as a result, Peter and Ron came to our support. And we looked at this site. There's Helmut in the background together with Raquel. And we decided to make the Rio de Janeiro, it's not really a Rio de Janeiro, it was just sort of like the REGUA hothouse for orchids. And you know what? We started doing this. We started building a structure. It's roughly 300 square meters. It's quite large. People were throwing out these rather large stones, and we brought in all these stones and organized them with a tractor just here. We arranged it there. We started putting in some posts and bringing some tree ferns in, the native tree ferns, and people started seeing Helmut at work as he came along. There's Raquel with the very, very first days. And this worked incredibly well. Even Rosario, she had to sell her ham, and she had to sell her farm in Petropolis. So she gave a bunch of these orchids that she'd collected here at REGUA on the survey that she'd done in 2008. And here we put them all back into this garden. This garden has been the most successful. Peter and Kathy, I really would like to thank you and Ron and all of Orchid Conservation Society who helped us with this grant to be able to make this work. And today, it's what kids really love. It's all those visitors who come in with their little magnifying glasses. Everybody comes in to see the jewels of the forest, because up to now they were known as parasites. Orchids we didn't know as epiphytes. They always thought they were parasites, which is completely erroneous. Of course, you know that. So we brought in all these kids, and all the visitors now look and go into this orchid house. And this is, if you want long-term conservation, if we want to be successful in the protection of this 450 square kilometers, it starts with these little guys. If we can leave all our tiny visitors with a smile, enraptured smile of having fulfilled and made a moment of their lives, then I think that is exactly the message that we need to take towards the future. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure I've extended my time, but thank you very much. And if there are any questions, Raquel and myself are here to answer you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Actually, your timing is perfect, and there are, in fact, some questions. So let me get started with those. Near the beginning, you mentioned a book that was called Something in Firebranders. Can you say what the full title of that book is?
Yeah, I can write that down. It's Warren Dean's Broad Axe and Firebrand. That is the definitive history of the Atlantic rainforest, and describes how all of it, through the firebrand means obviously the cattle and making pastures, but also the axe, as you have to axe it all down, cut it all down. Warren Dean, a wonderful American. Yeah, Broad Axe and Firebrand.
Great, thank you. Next question was, Janet asks, do you amend the soil in any way where new trees are planted on the degraded hillsides?
That's a good question. We have contracts. We are able to today. REGUA is dependent on has a budget of about $600,000 a year. That's what we work in. We're responsible for this number of acres. So accountability-wise, it's a very reasonable project. And about 30% of our income comes from tourism. 30% of our income comes from restoration projects. We managed to reach out to some institutions like the Rainforest Trust, DOB, Saving Nature, World Land Trust, who are very supportive, and we get some grants for specific salaries, and that helps us with about 20%. And then we get grants from our board, from our council. These are generous patrons who have been with us since the beginning of 2001 for about another 12%. And lastly, we have about 5%. Can't remember what the other 5% is, but something that's good. It's a good question. Tree planting we take very seriously. That's it. Tree planting we take very seriously, and I've always been passionate about trees because I was brought up near Kew Gardens and used to go into the gardens every day in my life almost. And when I came out here, I just became impassioned. When I was 19, I came and I was just found this most exquisite place, and I started planting, gathering seeds, and as fun seeing them grow and then planting them out because my grandfather had done the same. And early on, I realized that if you want to see the trees big, all you got to do is plant them early in your life because you're going to see massive trees. So that became a sort of leitmotif for planting trees. And I started planting, and basically you start understanding how nature works. So the question isn't exactly it's observing nature and helping nature in trying to coaxing nature to return on our own steam. And so if you're a good observer, you start seeing which trees grow in which conditions, and you start using them and testing them in these rather poor conditions. And basically you can get them growing. And I think today, as Ken was saying, UN as well, I think we're in a problem, aren't we? We're facing all the problems the world faces. So I think we have to be a little bit in terms of, it's similar to what Ken was saying. Perhaps we've got to lose a few species. But what I'm saying with that is actually maybe certain areas that cost too much, maybe we just have to leave those behind because I think we've got to reach to scale and try and be as effective as possible and as efficient as possible with the few resources that we've got. I hope that answers your question.
I think that answers part of the question. But what I took from that is you don't necessarily amend the soil when you plant a tree, but you do evaluate which trees are likely to survive in which situations and plant trees in situations where they're likely to be successful.
Correct, Ron. Actually, so just to go quickly through it, we desiccate the grasses. When we have grasses are very naughty, very competitive, very aggressive. We desiccate the grasses, we do one application of glyphosate, and then we go with this petrol digger, which creates a micro condition very favorable for initial tree growth. We then put in a very low nitrate substrate that helps the trees grow, a little fertilizer. And then basically we leave them alone. So we don't putting in lime, we're not changing, and we use the desiccated grass as a large ground cover, which actually works very well for about 6 or 7 months. So that protects the ground from heavy rains. It also reduces the temperature of the soil. And so you offer the most favorable conditions, and you try and block plant in the beginning of your rainy season, at the beginning of spring, let's say, so that they take advantage of natural rains.
Great, thank you. A few other questions. So Sebastian asks, do you have data about how much time a regenerated forest needs before epiphytic orchids start colonizing in your area?
That's great. Robin Chasden was here and visited all the areas that are over 100 years old and right next to areas with epiphytes. No way, Jose. They just don't come in. They'll take 1,000 years to come in. And David Miller was also very decisive about that. He was saying the whole forestry logical structure is based on a very short-term game, and in order to be able to guarantee their own probably their own salaries in a way. I'm being a bit cruel and a bit offensive here. I hope there are no forestry engineers here. But you know, tropical forest, as David Attenborough said, these are the great cathedrals of our time, the natural cathedrals of our time. We have to save every one of them, and we have to try and find some alternative composites for wood. We shouldn't be needing all of this wood. You in the US, you use all pine trees that are come from plantations to make all your trees. I mean, why doesn't the world do that? You know, I mean, you know, that's an example of sustainability which far surpasses the need for tropical timber. We don't need tropical timber, Ron.
So I remember talking to David at one point about his perception of the succession of a restored forest, and that you start off with the trees, and then you start off with some, that orchids are not the first epiphytes to be able to survive in a restored forest, that you have to start off with things that require relatively little moisture, like tillandsias, for example, or other small, relatively desiccation tolerant epiphytes, before the more desiccation intolerant epiphytes like larger bromeliads and orchids start to be able to survive. Is that something that you've observed as well?
It is, yes. You know, we plant a mix of about 60% pioneer trees. Now, pioneer trees, as opposed to climax tree species, are those that are mostly going to cover and create a canopy. What you really need to do, every forestry engineer will say, is that you really need to reduce humidity. You really need to increase humidity and reduce temperature, and you do that through the canopies. So you get your fast growing trees. They extend a nice canopy of the soil over the ground. They reduce the temperature. They produce a copious amount of leaves and they break down, and that starts building up all the humus in the soil. And basically you start offering those climax tree species which can't tolerate very high incidences of light, and they they slowly grow and they burst through the canopies of the pioneer trees, and hey presto, you've got your great forest. Mary was saying about bromeliads are really necessary for increasing humidity. Absolutely. But before that, Mary, you can actually get your pioneer trees growing and forming a dense cover. And you know, it becomes very sensorial. So what we do is we take all our kids, put them in a line, ask them to close their eyes, and they all hold hand to hand, and we take them in Indian file from the pasture into the forest. And we ask them to relate their experience. First of all, they tell you, well, from in the pasture, I couldn't smell anything. Now there's this sort of dankness of humidity I can smell. I can start smelling the forest. They sense the temperature drop immediately. There's a 5 degrees centigrade temperature drop. They start hearing sounds of all the birds calling. They start smelling all the smells of the forest, as I mentioned to you before. And lastly, when they open their eyes, their eyes dilate. So they're not squinting anymore, they're open eyes. And that's exactly the power of the forest as what to do, that's what its function is. And of course, we plant trees, and we plant trees on scale because we need the soil to act as a sponge. And the soil acting as a sponge, you know, I mean, there's a lot now of mycorrhiza, fungi, all working with the tree roots and communicating in between, forming sort of global village underneath the soil. We want all these guys working with the decomposition of organic material into the soil. So this is where all the fungi work, and huge copious amounts of insects. This is something which Ken talked about in his brilliant presentation about the collapse of insects around the world. And what we're trying to do is trying to create the best possible habitat for insects, so that the insects become the main column, the main foundation for all these forests. So humidity is great. Bringing in bromeliads is great. Bringing in orchids is great. They take naturally a very long time in a natural circumstance. What we've found, and I think that Rosario was very clever, was bringing in the Harrisoniana in our Tabebuia forest, because we can form Tabebuia forests within 20 years, which is a really short cycle. And these are all on wetlands. And then if we can put oncidiums and cattleyas and other orchids, and as well as the tiny little tillandsias and bromeliads on them. We rapidly offer a sort of we jump ahead in the terms of the natural evolution, natural colonization.
Great, thank you. And just one final question, and then I think we'll wrap up. Marin asks, is REGUA a successor of the Rio Trust that was started by David Miller and Richard Warren?
No, we used to go very often to David's place, and David came here and he wrote his book in our house. He wanted a week to be able, or 10 days, he and Bell, to wrap up this book because it was just taking forever. We managed to get the funding for him, but we've always been our own independent charity organization here. And David, very often, he would actually ask us if we didn't want to be able to buy his area before. It's now been sold to a different, luckily, Bell was able to pass it to a different association, a different organization that's related to Kew Gardens. So that's very good news that they're going to continue. But it's statutorily, so our own statutes for our own NGO dictate that we actually have to concentrate all our work within the Guapiaçu watershed. And I think that makes a lot of sense, Ron, because it means that any property that comes up for sale, we're interested in. Obviously, all these things in magnitudes of funds, they take a lot of time to be able to fund. But we're finding that people are rallying to our support and are helping us because they actually start seeing this, that we can do it. I mean, we've bought 120 properties to be able to sum this 20,000 acres. And I would say there's hope because people are starting to see that there's more, the area is more beautiful, that it is more functioning, that the water is there, and that we're able to stop this insidious crime of just urban expansion and covering everything with houses, which you're so familiar with in South America. So we're not part of the Davids, and we support him. We know Alexandri
Antonelli.
Sorry? Antonelli, that's right. We know him very well. We actually went there with Peter, and it's great. They have they work right on the top of the mountain there where David has. But it's very interesting because we look at the lowlands being the most important contribution to the safeguarding of the high altitudes. So we have these southwestern winds that come and bring a lot of humidity. And if we're able to create a large enough lowland reserve, I think we will gradually increase facing climate change, facing all these adverse effects that you're seeing even all around the world. I think we have a greater chance to be able to provide a greater protection for these high altitude forests and all their orchid populations.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. I greatly appreciate your presentation. Thanks to all of our presenters today. It was really enjoyable. And I certainly learned quite a bit